Another moonlit night, now in early spring, and Roland and I out in the pleasant chill under a cloudless sky, walking along our accustomed woodland path. No crickets as yet, but considerable amounts of freshly sprouting greenery underfoot. We had no need to turn on our flashlights, so bright was the moon and the light pouring down on us. There had been rain earlier in the day, and the air had a rinsed, pluvial freshness about it, as well as aromas of new foliage and the faint, sharp sweetness of early blossoms. I did not recall having set out. As a rule, our walks together took place during the day, but apparently something had summoned us out after dark. All I could remember was a vague image at the edge of my mind of Roland sitting before me with his leash dangling from his jaws, and all I knew now was that we were well on our way toward the larger of the forest ponds. We'd already crossed the low wooden causeway spanning the shallow rivulet, and now the mouth of the clearing was visible ahead, a fan of moonlight lying across it like a curtain of shining blue satin. The peacefulness was so profound that I felt as if I were floating, as was so often the case for me. I could not be certain whether I was awake, or only partly awake, or walking in a lucid dream. I knew only that I had no desire for it to end any time soon. "How far shall we go?" I asked Roland aloud, merely in whimsy, and certainly expecting no response. But he did respond. "Only as far as the little lake," he said, without turning his head to look back at me. "It's a special night, and I have something planned." He paused beside a large but ordinary-looking oak and began sniffing with particular animation and even apparent relish at its base. "What is it?" I asked after several seconds of this. It was several more moments before he replied. He seemed to be concentrating on some especially delectable redolent still clinging to the tree's roots. Finally, he drew back his snout, closed his eyes, took a deep breath as if luxuriating in the moment, and murmured, "Exquisite, exquisite." "What?" I asked, genuinely fascinated. "What is it?" He looked back at me over his shoulder, and as difficult as it often is to make sense of canine facial expressions, I could see that he was wearing what could be only a smile of deep contentment. "Forgive me. I almost passed right by it," he remarked. "At first I failed to notice. It was obscured by the musk of that irksome fox. I'm afraid he appears to have been dining on an elderly chipmunk. But then I caught a trace of it, sweeter, more elusive, more delicate, yet more durable." "What?" "The scent of fairies out for an evening traipse." This, I confess, rendered me temporarily at a loss for words. I looked down at the roots of the tree, searching for what I could not have said. Small phosphorescent footprints, perhaps, or a dainty ring of toadstools. "Fairies?" I finally whispered. "You can pick up the fragrance of fairies?" "Of course," he said. "If one can see them, why shouldn't one be able to nose them out? Why would the higher, more divine sense be less able to detect them than the lower is?" "The lower?" I began, but then I stopped, took a deep breath of my own, and shook my head. "To be honest, I've never seen any fairies either." "Never?" There was an audible note of incredulity in his voice. "Are you sure?" I shrugged haplessly. "None that I recall, and I don't imagine I'd forget. My eldest brother, that is, did once, long ago, when he was a small child in Florida, looking out the window of a train that had briefly come to a standstill." "Just the once?" asked Roland. "As far as I know." He nodded thoughtfully. "I imagine that there are some fairly exotic species of fairies down in Florida. Nature is so wild and indomitable there, and so menacing." "Do fairies vary by clime?" I asked. "Of course," he said. "They're nature spirits, after all. They wear the aspect of the ecology they personify, though, of course, they change over time as the landscape is altered or circumjacent human culture evolves. There's a kind of cultural cross-pollination between fairy kith and humankind. In general, for instance, European fairies have become considerably more refined and decorous over the millennia than what they once were. Most of them today tend to be very reluctant to engage in the sort of mischief they were once notorious for getting into. At most, they're likely to knock on doors in the dead of night and to abscond with some milk and cake, and they're frequently socialists now. Not all of them, of course, not in the Caucasus, for instance, but for the most part, they're good Europeans." "How do you know?" I started to say, but Roland took no notice. "On the whole, of course, the fairies of the Americas have a wilder quality still than their old world cousins do. They're still, how to phrase it, rather more titanic than Olympian." Now my memories of those previous walks with Roland, when I thought I had imagined him uttering discernible words, came floating back to me. That was what I heard, I said. You've mentioned fairies to me before. I was sure I'd imagined it. He merely shook his head, sniffed somewhat impatiently, and resumed walking, pulling me gently along behind him. Of course I have, he remarked after a few seconds. There's so many of them about. And you can see them still constantly? He sighed. Not constantly, he replied. No one sees them constantly. They're secretive by nature, and mercurial, and very elusive. Sprightly, you might say. I see them often enough, though. You would too if your mind weren't so well trained not to do so. Surely you know that the world we inhabit, the world we sense and see and believe we know by direct acquaintance, is as much a convention of shared consciousness as an objective field of sensations. It's a construction of the collective imagination, the collective metaphysical intentionality, as it were, of a given time, a spiritual epoch. I did not answer right away. Instead, I cast my gaze upward at the dark silhouettes of the treetops, some of their branches as yet only sparsely foliated, against the dark blue sky and gleaming stars. Was any of this really happening? It was also very tangible, so acutely immediate, so full of sounds and scents and shivers of vital reality that it felt impossible to doubt it. Well, I said at last, I don't know if I know it, strictly speaking, but I've long suspected as much, certainly. And you're right to have done so. He paused briefly, raising his nose to take in some passing fragrance. Then he continued on toward the clearing, now perhaps only 30 yards or so ahead. Your species, I fear, has lost so many crucial avenues of perception over the past several centuries that even things that were once quite conspicuous to you have become all but entirely invisible, except perhaps in rare and fugitive glimpses. It's not surprising if you've become wholly insensible to things that always required a certain spiritual tact to see clearly, or for any extended period. In times long past, the fairies and the spirits of nature and the gods showed themselves to your kind quite openly, and your kind was dependably able, for the most part, to catch at least a glimpse of their glory as it passed by. Even in more recent centuries, they were still apt to make an appearance or two to you at some time or another in your lives, maybe most often in childhood, but now... He shook his head and his voice dropped to a somewhat grimmer and more lugubrious register. But now you've filtered so much of it out. That's what the brain and nervous system are, after all, a filtration system, a way of reducing the totality of conscious communion to the manageable dimensions of particular, punctiliar, subjective psychologies. But now the filter has become practically opaque where certain aspects of reality are concerned. In the modern age, the age of the mechanical philosophy, you haven't much chance of seeing those luminous dimensions of reality where fairies tend to flaunt themselves. Once the mechanistic method became a metaphysics and a habitual way of seeing the world, so much that's truly alive and beautiful and mysterious was lost to your kind. Living spirits, especially my people, fortunately, never succumb to these frightful materialist superstitions. So I don't have to work so hard to pierce the veil of the quotidian and to see the radiant figures that dance under the blazing moon in the courts of that other kingdom.